Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thanks again for taking the time to participate tonight. This is our third webinar, and we are now going to have a fourth webinar next week, just so that we can go through everybody's soil test results and work all the way through each one. So, and then we'll be able to get some, discussion on the purpose of that soil sample, why it was taken, etc. So once again, we've got our presenter is David Hardwick from Soil, Land, Food. So this is session 3, and it's soil tests and nutrients, and using soil tests to monitor some nutrients such as phosphorus and sulfur. So once again, these webinars are supported by Southern Gold through funding from the federal government's National Landcare program under 2 of the projects that I work on, the Profitable Producers Creating Healthy Landscapes project and the eBeef Smart Farm project. Once again, everyone knows the deal here by now. I think that it's a casual workshop style. We do encourage some interaction. We hope to be finished by 7:30. Is that right tonight, David? Will be right?
Yeah, about an hour.
Yep. Okay, but we can discuss things further if anyone wants to, and if you wouldn't mind just keeping yourselves muted while the presentations are underway. And just a reminder that it is being recorded. Also a reminder that we've got these erosion control field days coming up, and property on-site recommendations for those that want to snavel those opportunities. There's only a few vacant little spots left for property site visits. So Kabaroo is the 27th of July and Sedan Dip the 28th, the ones for this group. And other upcoming events we've got is some pasture recovery field days, and we're going to kick off, thanks Cole, with a Lara field day, and this will be by Trevor Hall. At the Lara field day, we'll be looking at not only Mitchell grass recovery or pasture recovery after the floods, but we'll also incorporate an improved pasture forage cropping day, so that we can kind of, get that underway for people that want to start looking at, doing something along those lines, which will be particularly relevant if we get the MLA PDS, producer demonstration site, going. So keen to kick that off. The Wednesday the 26th, I'm not sure whether I can find another property between Lara and then Richmond, because if I don't, we'll be going to Wilbur Downs, which is just the other side of Richmond, at the Richmond Beef Challenge trial site. So we do that on the 26th if we can't find a third property. And then if we find a third property, we'll be having that the Wilbur Downs Day on the Friday. Okay, basically that's it from me. So I'll pass you over then, David, if you'd like to share your screen. I'll just get off this one. And all yours, David, you should be able to share yours now.
Yep.
Oh, whoops. Sorry. So, hey, Bob.
Okay, g'day, everyone.
See you there. Sorry, all yours, Dave.
Yeah, g'day, everyone. Thanks for coming back. Tonight we're doing nutrients. I'll just get everyone that doesn't have their screen, their TV or their video on because of connectivity or whatever, just to give me the thumbs up, just to hit that little thumbs up, just so I know you're not technically dead, and we know you're here with us. So if you just hit the little thumbs up there, thanks Lachlan, got that one. So Navenka, Colin and Shane, if you guys can find your thumbs up icon, thanks Colin, I got that. That way I just know you're there. And if I stop and just check that you're following me, just give me the thumbs up. But Shane and Navenka, hopefully you guys can find your thumbs up at some point, and just give us the thumbs up. Be good. Anyway, I'm going to shoot straight into it because as usual, we've got a bit to cover. I'll just get my chat up. So that's the other thing. Thanks, Navenka, I got that. So if you do need to punch something into chat. Most of you, hopefully everyone knows where your chat is, or because we're a small group, just turn on your mic and jump in. So all good. Righto, well, I'll jump straight in. Today we're doing soil tests and nutrients. And so particularly we're going to look at phosphorus and sulfur, which are two really important nutrients for crops and for legumes as well. So if we're talking legumes and crops, then they're two big ones. So I thought we'll pick on them. So for just a bit of a refresh, hopefully everyone can see the screen all right there. Last time we used a soil test to look at soil health. And in particular, we looked at organic matter, carbon to nitrogen ratio, and pH, if you all remember that. And we went over a few soils. And Shane and I are screen. All good. Righto. Thanks. Okay, now I got it. All right. I'm on the border down here, Albury Wodonga, so I'm living in two worlds at the moment because they got us in lockdown, but we can still go over the border, Robert. So yeah, it's all a bit confusing for me. So then we also looked at, do I have any limiting factors? And so we were using a soil test to look at, do I have enough organic matter? I might just grab one up in a minute. Let me just grab a soil test while we're talking. Oh, wrong one. Which one? This one here. So here's an example of a soil test from EAL that some of you guys have, and I've got your soil test tonight, Nigel, so I'm a bit more organised. But we looked at organic matter, if I can get my little squiggly doodah going. We looked at organic matter like I am on this test here, and then we looked at the results, 0.8 or 0.9 or 1.3 or whatever the results are, and then we decided, is that number good, bad, or indifferent? And we did that by looking at benchmarks. And if we're low on our benchmark, then we've got a soil constraint, and it's probably limiting production potential and yield potential. So that's kind of what we did with our soil test last time. We looked at organic matter, carbon to nitrogen ratio, pH, and looking at soil constraints. And if you remember, soil tests really help you with three things in life. They help you with understanding the type of soil you have, how to manage soil health, like we did last week, and then what we're doing today is fertility. And so soil type, just a quick refresher on week one, is that total fertility. And if you remember, again, we looked at some totals on your test. So again, just picking on this test here, on the bottom of it, we've got the total calcium, the total phosphorus, the total sulfur, which are down on the bottom of your test. And we saw that some soils have a good level and some soils have a low level of kind of overall fertility. So that's the totals that we did on the first session. And many soils will either have a little bit of nutrients in the tropics, but some of them can be quite fertile, like some of your heavier textured soils. And then we looked at the size of the charge in your soil, this CEC. If you remember, we looked at the CEC, which again, on a soil test, you find it at this thing called the cation exchange capacity, which is kind of near the bottom of the first page. This thing here, cation exchange capacity, and some soils have a small CEC, and some of you guys have CECs of like 40 and 50. So some of your downs country, those cracking soils and the heavy textured soils, actually have a very large charge on them. So that's kind of what we did in that first week soil type. And then we jumped to soil health last time, and we looked at, does my soil have enough organic matter, or carbon? Does it have enough? Is the quality of the organic matter all right? And that's what we use the carbon to nitrogen ratio to talk about. And that's similar to digestibility of feed in cattle. So just imagine you're looking at a whole bulk of feed in front of the animals. What's the quality of it? I might have a lot of feed, but what's the quality of it? And that's what the carbon to nitrogen ratio tells you. Basically, the digestibility of the organic matter for the soil microbes. And the third thing we looked at was pH. So if everyone can just quickly find the pH on their soil tests, just to get warmed up. If you've got your soil test, just have a quick look for your pH. So I've got your soil tests here. Where are they? Southern Gulf. No, hang on a minute. And I'll just get it. Here we are, Julia Creek. So we've got your soil tests, and near the top of the tests, hopefully you can find it, is your pH. And so hopefully you've found that. And then it's measured in 1 to 5 water. That's the method that we use, 1 to 5 water. There is different ways to measure pH. but the one we're using in this group is 1 to 5 water. And there's your result. So there's the first soil at 7.3, there's the next one at 6.58. And I think we had a soil that was a bit different than most of the other soils that was, pH of 7, there's one of 8.2. So most of the soils have over 7 or nearly 7 and above, which means they're alkaline, neutral to alkaline. So that's kind of what we've covered so far with a little bit of a brief kind of summary of what we did. We looked at those 3 things. Today we're going to do the key thing of looking at 2 nutrients, phosphorus and sulfur, and identify any potentially limiting nutrients. So I might have a paddock or a land type that is really poor in ground cover, no perennial plants growing, and yet it can have heaps of phosphorus. So in that case, it might have heaps of phosphorus, but if there's no perennial plants growing, perennial pastures, and there's bare ground and no ground cover and crusting soil, that's fertility's wasted. So that's the difference between fertility and soil health, is that I can have fertility, but if the soil's not functioning, capturing water, having good root systems, then you're just wasting that fertility. And vice versa. I can have a soil in really good health, like good perennial grasses, good coverage, soil's in good condition, but doesn't have much fertility. And you kind of have to manage both of these things, and they don't always align, unfortunately. All right, so let's jump in and just have a quick look at the theory around soil fertility. So soil fertility is the level of nutrients in a soil. For example, the level of phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, zinc, etc. Sorry about that bar at the bottom there. I can't seem to get rid of it tonight. And so it's the actual level of nutrients in a soil, in a topsoil. And that soil's fertility mainly comes from the rocks that the soil forms from. So if you remember, I think I've shown you guys this picture before, most nutrient elements are stored in the minerals of the soil. So that's where most of your fertility comes from. And through a process called weathering, rocks break down into minerals. So through that weathering process, all your rocks break down to minerals. Those minerals contain nutrients. And so it's your soil minerals that really give your soil its fertility. And on day 1, webinar 1, we looked at the total fertility that came out of your minerals. And so these minerals contain the nutrients. And so you have different soils having different mineral composition, basically different levels of fertility. And because they're all from different minerals, we get different types of soils, and usually different soil types have different levels of fertility. And the other key thing which is important is the different balance of fertility. So some soils might have heaps of calcium and very low phosphorus, and vice versa. And so it just depends a little bit on the rock type where your soils form from. And so the other thing that influences fertility is how old the minerals are, how long they've been weathered for, and how intensive the rainfall's been on it. So in ancient landscapes, like really old landscapes like the Northern Territory and Western Australia Northwest, which are some of the oldest landscapes on Earth that haven't been sort of transformed through volcanic activity over time, they're just really strongly weathered, and so a lot of the elements are gone from the topsoils. And so that's why in the Northern Territory, if you remember, they've got 3 types of soil. They've got the yellow shit, white shit, and red shit, because they just don't have much fertility left in the landscape. So over time, as those minerals continue to break down through both environmental and biological weathering, so by that I mean the actual little minerals in your soil continue to break down, and what happens at that point is nutrients get released and become available. So there comes a certain point in time as your minerals in your soil continually get weathered, broken down, both by living things like microbes in the soil and plant roots, as well as by just natural climatic factors. There comes a point where nutrients get released and they're now available in the soil. And at that point, bacteria can get them, earthworms can get them, and plant roots can get them as well. So that's what we call available fertility. So at some point, obviously these rocks release their nutrients and life can get a hold of them. So in a natural landscape like this North Queensland rainforest, the whole ecosystem or the whole community of life, from the trees to the earthworms to the cassowaries and all the birds, everything as a whole community has evolved this really complex system, what we call an ecosystem. And that whole system really efficiently cycles and makes available nutrients. So if you think about it, evolution wouldn't work if you're not optimizing nutrition. So evolution doesn't work where we don't optimize nutrition and nutrient access. So the whole system is really complex, but it evolves this way to adequately cycle balanced level of nutrients for the whole community, for the trees, for the birds, for the insects, the whole show. So even on a very low fertility soil, a rainforest can be quite productive because it evolves this really efficient nutrient cycling process. And the term I'm going to use for that is nutrient cycling capacity. So I'll give you a little example from North Queensland. Like after a cyclone towels up the forest, for the first couple of years, that rainforest is just in regrowing mode. So until it fully leaves up again and the trees start to regrow, it's a little bit slow. But as soon as those trees re-leaf and the trees start to get a bit of photosynthesis panels on them, those forests can grow, 10, 20 tons per hectare per annum. And the phosphorus, the nitrogen, the sulfur, the trace elements for that growth is all out of the minerals of the soil. And some of those soils are granites. Those rainforests are growing on granite, quite low fertility soils, and yet they can be really productive in their high growth phase after sort of a cyclone. But of course, there is natural limitations to fertility, and that depends on your soil type. And as you guys know, you've got some soils with high phosphorus, as you've seen, and some soils that just inherently there's a phosphorus or sulfur or some other element limiting them because of the soil type. So that's what happens in a natural system. But in an agricultural setting, whether it's up your way or down here in the colder country of southern New South Wales, our aim's also to optimise fertility. And we're also trying to achieve adequate and balanced available nutrients. That's what we're after. So it doesn't matter if you've got lots of phosphorus in your soil. If it's not cycling and available, you may as well be talking about Mars because the plants aren't getting it. So that's what we're really trying to chase, is adequate and balanced available nutrients. And so the key point here, and this is really relevant if you're thinking to grow some forage crops or put in legumes or just modify or improve a soil type or a land type, is that what's adequate and balanced in agriculture will depend on your enterprise, your production goals, and also the cost benefit. So just because someone says, yeah, you can grow hay on that paddock, you've got to do the numbers, because yes, you might be able to grow hay, but unless you've got a checkbook the size of Gina Reinhardt's, it might not be economic depending on the soil type. So you've really got to look at the economics of it as well as the agronomic side of it, if that makes sense. So yes, we want adequate and balanced, but some people are low input, low output, but they make money because they don't spend money. And other people like to really, have high production on a paddock. They put a lot of inputs in. As long as the economics stack up and they're making profit and they're maintaining the soil health, then there's nothing wrong with that too. But that's an economic or a business decision. And I guess before we jump in and start looking at phosphorus on a test and get you guys hands-on, the other key thing to think about in northern grazing landscapes is that you're usually not going to add fertilizers. So if your phosphorus is low, then you're usually not going to go out and buy a bag of fertilizer unless maybe it's an irrigation paddock or something. So you've got to look at other strategies for optimizing nutrient management, because you're not going to buy that nutrient in a bag. Whereas in cropping, like say this Rhodes grass paddock on a pivot irrigator near Charters Towers, you have that option of adding fertilizer. And that's this extra thing that farming does. It gives you the ability to minimize more tax by spending more money. So the real challenge is buying the inputs at the right inputs, not spending your money on stuff you don't need. Because if you want to do that, I'll send you my bank account. Okay, so the key thing is here, we're trying to achieve adequate and balanced nutrient levels in your grazing or your cropping landscape. And that fertility doesn't matter on soil type. And you can see it doesn't matter which soil types you're dealing with. That's the same thing. And so we need to follow a process. So I'm going to give you the 4 key steps to nutrient management, and then we're going to jump in and look at a soil test and practice the bit of the theory. The first one is to know your total fertility. So do I have a high phosphorus landscape, a low phosphorus landscape? How much calcium's in my landscape? So just knowing your totals, and that's what we looked at on the first session. The second one is to optimize the nutrient cycling capacity. Just like that rainforest naturally kind of evolves a complex system that makes nutrients cycle really effectively, we have to do the same in managed landscapes, in agricultural landscapes. And you can see here from this trial that I think I've shown you guys out of the US, where when they give the perennial grass recovery time, in this case only 4 weeks as opposed to every week, you can see the much larger root biomass that the perennial grass can build, and that's going to drive nutrient cycling. You've got a bigger topsoil that's under the influence of plant roots and the carbon and life. You're going to have more moisture going in that soil. The whole show is going to be cycling its nutrients much more efficiently. So that's what I mean by nutrient cycling capacity. So you've got to somehow maximize that. And then the third thing you do is assess your available nutrients. You might have heaps of total phosphorus, but do I have enough available? So that's what we'll use a soil test for in a minute. And this is a mixture of guys in the Northern Territory. One of these guys, this guy here, is a mango grower, mango and asparagus near Catherine. And then you've also got hay producers as well in that same group. But they've all got the same goal: is do I have enough available for mangoes or Rhodes grass hay or whatever it is I'm trying to grow? And finally, if you decide you haven't got enough available, one of the things you can do is lift fertility by either adding fertilizers, or you can use supplementation for cattle. Obviously, you can put out licks or medicate the water. So that's the fourth option you have, is to add nutrients if you think you need to. And that's often an economic decision as much as anything else. So in summary, to optimize your nutrient management, you don't just need to have nutrients in your soil, you need them to be cycling. And this is an example for you of chars, which is a tropical fruit, which you may or may not have heard of. This is near Townsville. This is the only commercial char orchard probably outside of the Amazon, where the tree comes from. And these guys planted, I think it was 12,000 trees. It might have been 16,000. And no one could tell them how much phosphorus and sulfur the trees need, because no one's ever done commercial agronomy on it. So the only way they know how much fertilizer to give them is they have to work it out. They have to monitor the trees, the yield, do tests, and come to their own benchmarks. And they're learning as they go, because it's a new crop. No one knows anything about it. Whereas the cane farmers nearby, they've got tables and charts and benchmarks, because their whole industry's funded all this research. So those guys don't even need to think about it. They just follow a chart. Oh, yeah, how much phosphorus I need depending on my test. So we can assess the soil test. The way to do it, to assess soil fertility, is looking at the levels of each of your nutrients in your soil, which we're about to jump into 2 of them. And we can also use a soil test to look at the balance between nutrients. So at this point, you're going, okay, it sounds all pretty good. But the key thing is that there's about 13 nutrients. So we have to look at the level and balance of 13 different nutrients, benchmark them all, see whether I've got enough zinc and boron and phosphorus and all the rest of it. So you can see, you can make it complex, but you can also keep it relatively straightforward, which is hopefully what we're going to do. So let's just pick on phosphorus, because it's a really important nutrient for life on Earth and in agriculture across the planet Earth. So I want you to get your soil tests out if you've got it. Something's just happened to my presentation, so bear with me. Not sure what happened there. Okay, so don't know what it's doing. Are you guys getting the loading icon coming up? Yep, that's a bit weird. Anyway, we'll keep going. This one's working. So what I want you to do is look on your soil test and find for me something that tells you about phosphorus in your soil. See if you can find out anything to do with phosphorus. And I'll just see if I can not wreck my presentation. Yep, that's going to wreck it. Okay, I've got to go back. Hang on a minute. Oh, that's how you do it. No. Okay, so yeah, that's it. No, the loading won't work. All right, so have a look on your soil test. So what have you found on your soil tests that tell you about phosphorus? Has anyone been able to find anything by looking at your soil tests? Just call it out or punch it into chat for me. I'll get the results up. What have you found? Anyone found anything to do with phosphorus on their test? So I'm assuming Shane, Colin, Lachlan, and Navenka that you guys are all good and you're following okay. I don't know if you've got a soil test or not. Nigel, I've got your soil test, so I know it's a bit of a different one. Has anyone been able to find anything to do with sulfur? Someone help me out here. Just give me a yes or no. Lachlan's found 2 cells with it. Yep. So 2 different parts. Yep. 3. Yep. Terrific. So if everyone has a look towards, if you've got the EAL test, and I'll pull yours up in a minute, Nigel, too, but if you've got the EAL test from this project, you'll see that near the top up here, where I think Lachlan's referring to, there's 3 different, you can see here it's got phosphorus, and then you can see here there's 1, 2, 3 different readings of phosphorus. So you can see here there's this part of the phosphorus story here. The other part of the phosphorus story is further down the test, and we had a look at this previously, but at the bottom of your test, you've also got your total phosphorus. So here's your total phosphorus. So you should have a total phosphorus. So that's a little bit like when you go to the bank manager to borrow money and they don't just want to know what's in your cash account. They want to know everything you own. Oh yeah, what's that fishing boat you got there in the shed? Do you own that? They want to know the whole picture, not just what's in your cash account. When you're borrowing money, they want to see the whole story. So that total phosphorus down there is the total story of your phosphorus. And up the top, those ones that you found, Lachlan, up the top, if everyone else has found them, those 3 there, they're estimates of available phosphorus. Has everyone found that? And if you have a look here, there's another one here too, soluble phosphorus. Does everyone see that soluble phosphorus just above it? 1.1 soluble phosphorus, and then the Bray 1 phosphorus and Colwell here. So these are all estimates of phosphorus, available phosphorus. You can see that this lab's given you more than 1 available phosphorus, but it's also given you the total phosphorus. And if I grab your test, Nigel, just so we can look at another test while we're going along. So this is your test. This is the Bony English test, correct, Nigel? That's the one we're supposed to be looking at. Yep. Sorry, the names sometimes throw me out. So you can see down on your test, which is laid out differently, but you can see they've put all your elements down towards the bottom. And you can see they've also measured phosphorus for you, and they've measured 2 different phosphoruses, Colwell and BSES. So you can see we've got the EAL test has done 5 or 6 different things on phosphorus. Your test has got 2, Colwell and BSES. So I'll come to the reason why. And there's only 1 of these that's relevant for you from an available point of view, and we'll go over that in a minute. But you can see that's how you find where your thing is. So I'll get that back. So you guys can see, if I come back to this, so the total phosphorus, we've found total phosphorus, we've found available phosphorus, and you can see that there's different sort of names given to what's called available phosphorus. So you can see the different jargon that we've already found. If we go to Nigel's test, we can see, Nigel, that there's 2 different available phosphorus that they're talking about, Colwell and BSES. And those of you that have an EAL test, you can see that, if I can find it, where is it gone? Here it is. You can see that you guys have they've given you 4 different available phosphorus estimates. And the reason they've done that is to confuse the hell out of you. No, I'm just kidding. The reason they've done that is because EAL just give you the whole kit and caboodle, but there's only 1 available phosphorus that's relevant for you guys in that part of the world, which is the Colwell, and I'll go over that in a minute. So that's the one that we're really going to be looking at. So let's just break it down a little bit. So the first thing we've done is total phosphorus. So I want you to find your total phosphorus and punch it into chat for me if you can. So Lachlan's the only one that gave me any response last time, but if you can punch it into chat, or if you can just turn on your mic and tell me what your total phosphorus is, that would be appreciated. I'll get up the tests here while you guys are doing that. So you guys might be able to tell me who's who. But that first soil there, Yambungan, whose is Yambungans? And oh, yep. So Colin, that's where have you got an EAL test, Colin?
I'm not sure, mate. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
What's it?
yes.
You do. So Colin, what we're looking for is total phosphorus, which is right at the bottom of your test. So down towards the right near the bottom, you've got all of these totals, and that's the one I'm chasing initially. So
Right,
5.6 to me looks like it's probably from your availables, and that's all right because it's quite common to mix them up. But yeah, down towards the bottom is the total reserve down this last part of your test. So what's the name of your property, Con? Then I'll be able to track it down here.
Lara.
Lara.
I think it's sample 11, yeah.
Sample 11, yep, righto.
Yep, Lara.
Sample 11, righto. So that's column number Q on mine. Okay. So if we go down the bottom, column Q, and I come across, and I think total phosphorus, sorry, we've got so many, 72. So Q72. So you've got 365 total, this one in here. So that's your total phosphorus.
Okay, mate, cool.
Yeah, does that make sense? So that's, Colin, that's like when you go to the bank to borrow money, they're going to ask you not just what's in your, your operating account. They want to know, what's hidden away in an asset, or they want to know the full picture. So that's what this totals does. It gives you the full picture. So Shane, that's the same. I have a feeling that Robert and Shane, you're giving me the available. So we're trying to find it from the bottom of the test. It'll be this down in this bottom area. All right, Nigel, yours doesn't. That's what I was hoping you'd find, Nigel. So that's the difference. So they, for whatever reason, they haven't done the totals on your test. So the reason is that it's not usually done on standard agronomic tests. So you found it, Lachlan. Navenka's got 51. Shane, you found, yeah, great. You guys have found them. So, yeah, so Nigel, yours, we'll get Nigel's up because it's a good example. So you can see how on the EAL test that you guys are getting, you've got a total phosphorus, and you can see on Nigel's, which I've put here, you can see they've given him the elements or the nutrients, but they haven't done total. There's no total. There's just the Colwell and BSES, which is available forms of P. So, yeah, they haven't done that extra test for you, Nigel. So it's a little bit like the bank. If the bank didn't ask you for your total asset, then if the lender didn't check that, then they're getting into trouble with head office, because the head office is going, how did you lend money to old mate without finding out his total assets? And I used to live in Armidale in northern New South Wales, and there was a really big scandal once with a big grazing family that got lent money by the ANZ, like we're talking millions of dollars, just on the veranda at the house with no proper assessment of the loan. And that whole big grazing family went under after a fair few years of that. But they used to get sort of just low doc loans from their local ANZ bank. It was a pretty big scandal in New England, I can tell you. So normally you want to know the full picture. And in a grazing landscape, Nigel, I'd suggest to you that knowing your totals is really helpful, because it just tells you the overall sort of long-term capacity of that land type. Whereas in agronomy, often we just worry about the availables for short-term thinking. Do I have enough for this crop next year? And that's what the availables is talking about. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense, but we'll get to availables in a minute. So you don't have availables. So the rest of you guys know what your totals are. 251, Navenka, you can see that land type doesn't have much total fertility. And so what you can do is just go, okay, what's my total sort of phosphorus? Is it high? Do I have a high, medium, or low phosphorus landscape? And those of you that were at webinar 1, excuse me, if you remember, I showed you these 9 soils, and you can see here I've put a bit of a, some reason my thing's not working tonight. I put a little bit of a range here on the right-hand side of this one. And so you can see total phosphoruses can range everywhere from less than 50 up to 3,000. I think I showed you guys a picture of grazing country up on the lava flow country, which has over 3,000 total phosphorus. So you guys have quite a range of total phosphorus if we get your soils up, and which is 72, and your total phosphoruses range from less than 50 right up to, what's the highest? 440. That's the highest phosphorus, whoever's that is. Whose is soil number L? Anyone want to claim the high phosphorus? Yeah, Redland Park.
Yep.
So
that's Lockie, Lockie and
yep.
Hannah.
Yeah. So Nevenka, on that land type, you know that phosphorus is going to be limiting the livestock because it's limiting the landscape. Whereas a nearby soil type that might be a very different, heavier soil with more phosphorus, phosphorus won't be the limiting factor. But in that soil type, phosphorus is a limiting factor. Potentially, we know just from the soil type and the totals. And here's the Northern Territory that I've been showing you guys, some Northern Territory soils. And I'll just make it a little bit bigger so it's easier to read. So here's some phosphorus across the Northern Territory. And you can see the highest one is 161. And then we've got one at less than 50. So they don't have much phosphorus in those soils up there. So that sort of gives you a feel for the overall potential fertility of your soil, and you can sort of score it. And low phosphorus country obviously often supplements very economic. So now we've got to look for available. So without going into it too much, soil scientists like to make it complicated by coming up with all different ways to measure available phosphorus and all the other nutrients. And it's the reason that there's so many different methods is because it's a difficult one to estimate because you're dealing with such a complex living chemistry. So the one that's used in Queensland for estimating available phosphorus is Colwell. So I want you to find your Colwell phosphorus on your soil test and just punch it into chat for me. And that's an estimate of how much of my total phosphorus is available this season. Because you've got to remember that phosphorus is cycling because of biological and plant activity as much as anything else. So see if you can find your Colwell phosphorus on your test. I'll just clear that and get the test back up. Yep, here we go. So hopefully you've seen that it's near the top, and where Lachlan found those 3 cells, it's this middle one. So Nigel, and you can see, Nigel, that even though you're using a different lab, they've used a Colwell method because that's the standard for Queensland, not just grazing, but for cropping. So yeah, you guys have found it. Nigel's got 12, Shane, you've got 22, you've got Lachlan's got 8.5 on a soil, Colin's got 5.6. Yeah, so you guys can see you've all found this number across here, and you can see that there's different levels of available phosphorus. Can everyone see that the amount of phosphorus that's available in a topsoil is usually a small portion of the total? Does that kind of make sense to everyone? That if your total's 200 and your available 6, then, and that's the same, that's pretty much the same for most nutrients on most landscapes on the planet. That the available, kind of what's available now, it's a bit like the business. The available cash to go and buy something is just a small part of the overall wealth in the business. Like, you know, your current asset and your overall assets, they're usually different unless I guess you're in illegal activity and you keep everything in cash. But most of the time, most of our wealth is locked up and it's not readily available. Okay, so let's keep going. And so you guys have found your Colwell P. So now the big question is, we've found our Colwell P. What's the big question? Sorry, so I've just gone over the available versus the total. And the key thing to remember is that your available phosphorus is kind of what's in the soil solution as well as in organic matter. So the total minerals is 1, but this is where your available phosphorus hangs out and the plant gets it from. But this is the key money question is, do I have good levels of available phosphorus or low levels? So here's some benchmarks for you guys. 5.6, Colin, that sucks. Well, mate, why did you buy the place? No, I'm just stirring you. So don't be too stressed, Colin. So Nevenka, you can see, Nevenka, from your soil results that not only do you have a small total fertility on that soil type, but the available amount is also really low at 2.3. That's right. So Colin, there's always someone worse off than you, mate. So, but Nevenka, I'll have to keep your hopes up, because in the Northern Territory where they have bugger all phosphorus, you can still be profitable. Don't feel that you can't be profitable on that soil. It just means you've got to manage it within its limitations. So you can see that's a benchmark for you if you're grazing in Northern Australia for available phosphorus with the Colwell test. So anyone that's under 8, so the general research that was done by MLA and over many decades by the DPIs and stuff, the rule of thumb is that Colwell available phosphorus of 8 and above, you have adequate phosphorus for the landscape, most of the year round. If you're thinking to grow hay forage crops or whatever, if you're thinking to open up some country for crops, you need to have more available because you have a higher yield potential. So hopefully that makes sense, that the benchmark's different because I'm trying to grow a bit more than what just a grazing landscape would do, especially if you're irrigating. So I would suggest to you that if you're in hay production, especially if you're irrigating, you need to be thinking of for adequate available phosphorus, at least 30 Colwell P, 20 to 30 dry land, and if you're irrigating above that. Does that kind of make sense to everyone? So if you've got a paddock that you're about to crop and you're looking at this Colwell test and you're at, say, Novenka, you're at 2.3, then you've got 2 options. You either add a hell of a lot of fertilizer, which there's nothing wrong with fertilizer, but when you have to add too much or a lot, it makes efficiency problematic. But the second thing is you've got to be realistic what yield you can get. But if you are growing a forage like a Rhodes grass hay paddock with 2.3 available Novenka, for sure the paddock won't be growing. You won't be getting much dry matter growth. You'll be wondering why the grass isn't growing. And that's the problem that I've seen up there in some of those where people don't have much agronomic support. They think I'll just chuck on nitrogen, urea, to get the grass to grow or the hay to grow, and it doesn't grow. And they're going, well, I'll put on double the rate of fertilizer, still doesn't grow because it's the wrong nutrient. That's not the nutrient that's limiting. In this case, it's phosphorus. So hopefully have a look at your targets, have a look at your result against your target for your enterprise. So do that, and then just let me know whether you're below your target or above your target for your enterprise. So if it's a paddock that you're going to do something like hay production or whatever, or improve pastures that you really want to grow a lot, then so Colin, you're below. Yep. Lachlan, you're above. Yep. So that's good. That means at the moment, phosphorus isn't limiting your enterprise. So hopefully you guys can see it's the same thing with soil health. I've got my results and I set a target. But in nutrient management, that target depends on what I'm aiming to do. Whereas organic matter, it doesn't matter whether I'm growing hay or just grazing or growing mangoes. I need a minimum amount of organic matter. But for nutrients, the benchmark will be variable depending on what you're doing and what your yield goal is. Shane, so you're borderline. So Shane, that's the tricky one, and we'll go over it in a minute. But when you're borderline, it's hard to know whether putting phosphorus out will be economic or not. That makes sense. So let's go over it. So if you're at or above your target, then you make a smiley face like Lachlan's done. So you can buy. So I think I mentioned to you guys, get those highlighter pens to make it easier to read your soil test. So you can just put a tick against that available phosphorus tick. So you're high. And if you're marginal like you are, Shane, then you just put a not sure sort of face. And if you're well below, like Novenka's soil paddock, then it's a grumpy face, because for sure phosphorus is limiting potential yield. You're not, from an agricultural point of view, you're probably not getting as much as you possibly could for that rainfall and soil type. And it's just because phosphorus is low for whatever reason. So if you have a high phosphorus, like Lachlan's saying that you're above your benchmark, in that case, it's unlikely that phosphorus will give you any response. So there's no point putting out phosphorus at that point, Lachlan, because you've got enough. The only exception in grazing landscapes is, of course, in the wet season where you're growing so much biomass that that phosphorus can be limiting the cattle just because there's so much energy being grown. You know, they got all this forage ahead of them. So that's that kind of wet season supplementation strategy. But that's only because the amount of feed there relative to phosphorus is just, the ratio gets out of whack. So it's unlikely that you'll get bang for buck. If you're growing crops and you've got adequate available phosphorus, like 30 or 40 on your test, and you want to grow a hay crop or whatever, it's unlikely adding phosphorus is going to help you. And this is the problem with agronomy sometimes, commercial agronomy, is that it's commercial. And so you might get a recommendation for a fertilizer that has phosphorus in it, even though it's not your limiting nutrient at that point in time, if that makes sense. So you're kind of spending money on a nutrient that at that point you don't need. And phosphorus is a very expensive element. So if you're moderate, so this is the tricky one, Shane. So if you're borderline and you're cropping, then you're going to ask yourself, is it the main limiting nutrient or is something else more important? That's the tricky bit with cropping. With a grazing landscape, well, of course, you're probably going, is it economic to supplement? Or actually, are the cows adapted to that landscape? Is the genetics of the cows and the epigenetics, we call it, have the cows been in that landscape for, a few generations, and they've adapted to that lower phosphorus, so they're quite productive anyway. So the borderline is always the tricky one to know whether it's economic. I just want to show you guys a borderline example. It's on a different sort of thing, but it'll hopefully give you a feel for it. So this is, I've shown you this all before. This is a sugarcane field in North Queensland. And you can see they've done the test, and you can see they've done the Colwell test, just like you guys are looking at. In sugarcane, they don't use Colwell. It's the only one in Queensland that they don't use it. So they use this one here that was specially developed for them, the available phosphorus, BSES it's called. It's just the jargon for the test method. So that's the phosphorus that they use. But if you have a look, the results for this cane farmer are 21. And the benchmark that the lab or the agronomist has given them is between 20 and 50. So the benchmark, the agronomist is saying, if you're between 20 and 50, then you have adequate phosphorus, because that's apparently optimal. See how they put it in the optimal column? So if you have between 20 and 50, you're optimal. Well, these guys are at 21. So you can see how, Shane, that's sort of like you, that's borderline. So you've got to ask yourself, do I need to put phosphorus out or not? Because if I have really good, depending on the type of cane, like the variety of cane, the soil type, do I have any other problems like aluminium or any other soil health issues? It might be okay. If everything else is going all right, I might not need phosphorus. Again, if I have other problems and it's the wrong variety of cane, then I might need some, because even cane's variety specific. So you can see that it's a tricky one. And the usual way to do it is just buy the fertilizer anyway, because it makes you feel better. But it doesn't necessarily, and this is the problem the cane guys have, is they're now legislated on phosphorus. So they're not allowed to just buy it anyway. They used to. Now they actually have to follow law. They're in, these guys are under the hammer big time, which is a great shame, because it stops their flexibility in a way, both for too much and too little phosphorus fertilizer. But you can see that's a sort of borderline situation. So to make a decision there, you'd want to ask a lot more questions about, okay, what variety of cane, how's the cane been grown the last few years, all of those things before you'd make a decision. And that's just an example for you from a different situation. So yeah, that's the tricky one, the borderline. And Nevenka, you've got the grumpy face. Thanks for that. So if it's really, really low, Nevenka, you can put tears streaming down as well. And I guess the key thing is, if you're in a grazing landscape, then you're not going to put out fertilizer. So your question, the only ways you can deal with it is supplement the animals, and that can be really useful, or you just be realistic about what you can achieve on that land type. What's the carrying capacity of this land type? Or do I use it only at certain times of year for certain classes of animals? So these are some of the questions you have to match the capacity of the land to your enterprise. But supplementation, yeah.
I just comment on that one, David, Nevenka, or do you want to chime in there what the purpose of that soil test was? It was like, that's an area that Colin wants to see, do a bit of cropping.
Okay.
Just forage cropping.
Yep. Yeah. So definitely really low. So if you're going to forage crop that,
and same with coals.
Yeah, we just pulled the sorghum crop off it, forage sorghum off it.
Yep.
So
Well, there were two
I wasn't
reasons there.
actually
Oh,
sure.
sorry.
Sorry, yeah, with ours, just pulled the sorghum crop off it, and there was a test that I think Eloise did that was only sort of 50 metres away. It was about 15 parts per million at the start before we'd cropped.
Yep.
Would that sound roughly, or I'm just not sure how much one crop would take?
Yeah, no, look, there's a couple of things going on too, Colin. The time of year that you sampled is another thing. So if you're sampling like in the dry as opposed to when there's actively growing plants and moisture around, it's going to go up because all the microbes get busy and they cycle nutrients. So that time of year. And then the third thing is how you took the sample. Like they were 15 meters apart. Did you take 20 or 30 samples from that little area and put them in a bucket and mix it up? Or did you just take like a one spot and put that in the bag? These are the questions that I'll have for you to answer that.
Yeah, we'll discuss that next week. I did kind of wander around across that paddock there, Cole, and thumped as hard as I could to get that Cora in. It was hard.
Yeah, I think there's half a dozen at least tests out of the one area, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I would have taken at least 15, 20, 25. Yeah, look, it would have been 20, 25, I think.
Yeah, so Colin, you can see it does get influenced by season, and it can get influenced by high biomass. So if I was working as an agronomist for you, I'd ask you how the forage sorghum went. And if you said to me I got pretty good yields and I didn't see any discoloration or symptoms of phosphorus deficiency in the crop, then I'd say, okay, well, it may well have enough available phosphorus. And then we'd look at the total as well. So it could have been a seasonal testing different. So you can see here, I'm triple checking all the different aspects before I give you an answer, because these are the issues that can come up when testing for nutrients. Lachlan's got a question there. Is the benchmark yield value the same for both grass growth yield and the amount needed for cattle nutrient levels? No, so as I understand it with the MLA work over the decades in Northern Australia, Lachlan, is that they kind of looked at landscapes and soil coal well P, so available P in landscapes, and then they kind of correlated that through the trial work with animal blood levels and animal performance, because as you know, animals are getting a mixed forage from landscapes. So it's really hard to kind of go what's the growth yield in a pasture when there's quite different land types that animals are on, and they're getting a mixture of browse and grass forage as well. So it makes it tricky to do kind of yield to dry matter production to benchmark in grazing landscapes, just because there's a diversity of forage for them. So as I understand how the work was done, was they kind of realized that around 8 and below, you're starting to get animal performance issues in landscapes. But yeah, that's sort of hopefully gives you a bit of a rough answer. So it's not exactly the same. And from the other side too, like I'm giving you guys a benchmark of about 20 to 30. So as you can see, Colin's had a result at 15, because the other factors are coming into play here, like soil structure or acidity or low organic matter and poor roots. So Colin, you might have had a really good root system in that sorghum crop. It might have grown really well. Everything else might have been ideal for it. The rainfall or irrigation timing might have been really good too. So you lined all the other ducks up, because water is the biggest limiting factor for crops. So you can have everything else lined up and then you get no rain, or the rain falls at the wrong time. And you can blame the fertilizer or the agronomist, but it was just when the rain fell or didn't fall or whatever. So that's why, so there isn't a direct correlation between the two. They just kind of had to sort of, I guess, estimate Colwell P across a whole range of grazing land types, which is a little bit of a tricky thing to trial, I think. So I guess I'm just going to go through the key steps. I'll just skip through this. Hang on a minute. So I guess the first key step for nutrient management, whatever you're doing, whether you are going to crop grow a crop of sorghum or you're just in a grazing landscape situation, the first key thing, no matter what you're doing, is to optimize the cycling of the nutrients that are already there. So that means soil health. So if you're not optimizing what you've already got, then you're really not economically getting bang for buck. So Nevenka, in that paddock of yours, you don't have much in the total, but even though it's 51 total phosphorus, you've still got to get as much as that cycling as you can. So that's soil health, and I've shown you this picture before, but it's about building root systems, address any other soil health issues like acidity or compaction or whatever it is that are going to limit the ability of plant roots to grow. And so you improve soil health. So soil health will optimize the nutrients that you already have to cycle. Obviously, if you've got a small reserve like Nevenka's soil there, then you can only improve things by so much. And then you make the decision to add fertilizers if you need to. So in your case, you guys growing the sorghum, I'd suggest to you that having a target of around 20 for forage crops, available P is a target. So it's trying to aim for that. If you've got a good crop at 15, all right, so maybe you go, well, I'm happy at 15. It's an economic target for me, Dave. I'd say no worries. If you've seen crops grow well at 15 Colwell P, then I'm going to go with that. So you've got to have a target and make sure that that's the limiting nutrient. How do you know that it wasn't nitrogen or sulfur or another element that's actually causing you the problem? And so that's phosphorus. So I've just sort of quickly taken you through phosphorus. So I'm really mindful of time, and we will have one next week so we can kind of pull everything together. So I do want to give you one quick last 5-minute session on sulfur. So sulfur lives in your minerals, and it also lives in the available sulfur lives in soil solution and your organic matter. So I want you to find your sulfur. Here we go. So just the last thing to do is sulfur. So have a look for your total sulfur on your soil test, and then your available sulfur on your test. So I'll get your tests up while you guys are doing it. So have a look for your available sulfur, see if you can find it, and your total sulfur. So your total sulfur's at the bottom in the totals. Down here in this bottom part of the test, you'll see total sulfur. Nigel, you won't have total sulfur on your test because they haven't measured the totals. So, you don't know the long-term fertility potential of that soil type. That's what the totals give you, is that overall long-term stuff. But everyone else, so whose soil's J? So 284, Colin, yeah. So you can, Colin, that's reasonably high total. If I look at sort of total sulfurs across Australia, that's pretty good. Whose soil's J? Because J's got 930 total sulfur. So Robert, 113 total sulfur is kind of what you'd say moderate to moderate low total. It's not really low, but it's not high really. But whoever's got 930,
that's Nevenka.
Nevenka. So Nevenka,
Yep.
you got bugger or phosphorus, but you got more sulfur than everyone else in Australia. So you got to be happy with that. If you can make money out of sulfur, turn it into a paleo food or something and make money out of it. But so, yeah, you can see here that 930, and if I just go over to the benchmarks that you have on your soil test, they're kind of ranges for total. You can see that they range across different soils from 100 to 1,000 or thereabouts. So you can see yours is at the upper end of the range. So you've got a high sulfur landscape, and yeah, and it's you're probably going to have quite a bit of calcium too, which you do. And everyone can see this next soil, K, has a really high amount of calcium compared to everyone else's soils. So you can see totals are different on different soil types, but I'd suggest so that's the first thing. We're looking at total, and then we want to look at available. So did anyone find any available sulfur? It's up near the top of your test on the EAL, and you can see here, this is the available test here near the top, sulfur with the potassium chloride method, and you can see 3.8, 3.2, 1.3. There you go, Nevenka. So if you guys, Nevenka, if you guys buy any fertilizer to grow any crop in the next 10 years or 100 years, never ever buy anything that contains sulfur, because you're just wasting your money. Does that kind of make sense? You have more sulfur there than you need for the next 500 generations. So if people recommend you to buy a product with sulfur in it, say, look, I'd rather save the money and put it into something else. So Shane, at 8.3, you've then got to ask yourself the magic question, do I have enough available? This is the key we're asking ourselves. And Nigel, if we just jump to your soil, because again, it's a different soil test. Let's jump to that, wherever it is. Here we go. So Nigel, on your test, they've given you the test. It's actually a different method, Nigel. MCP is different than the one we've been looking at. They're the same. They're trying to estimate available sulfur, but they've given you it in a different method. And Lachlan, I can see, yeah, 211, Lachlan, if that's available, or is that total? So, yeah, so Nigel, they've given you one. The interesting thing for me is that they then haven't benchmarked it. So why haven't they given you any benchmark? And I can't give you the answer because that's surprising me. But if you're going to grow a crop here, you need to know, well, we know it's low, and I can tell you that that's not enough for crops. So you're going to be limited. So, but it would be good if the agronomist gave you a benchmark. So that way you can kind of say, well, I'm low, I'm moderate, I'm high. But yeah, at 1, you're very low. So if you're trying to grow high production forage crops of whatever type, or if you're trying to grow legumes into paddocks, sulfur will be pulling them up. You won't be getting a good result because sulfur's too low. So yeah, adding some sulfur is going to be helpful in that. But you can see how they've missed the benchmark, so it's a bit of a question mark on that one. So Lachlan, I'm assuming 211 is both available. Okay, so that's for 2 different soils. I might come back to that and have a quick look. So let's go across number 18. Yeah, okay, so 211 and 5.9. So they're your 2 soils there, Lachlan. So again, that soil there, depending on what you're aiming to do, but that soil there, no matter what you're trying to grow, even if you're trying to grow mangoes, like high yielding horticulture, you've got enough sulfur. You don't need to put any out. Yeah, that's a bit weird, isn't it? It's a data error, yeah, or it's actually a weakness in the methodology of how they've measured the total and the available, because they're different extracts. So the available extract, the potassium chloride, just might be in that soil type, might be more efficient at extracting it from the sample, if that kind of makes sense. But yeah, you can see that soil tests aren't black and white. But yeah, you can see here that at 211, at 211 available, you don't buy sulfur in the fertilizer. Whatever fertilizers you buy, don't get sulfur in the mix, in the blend. You're wasting your time. Whereas this 1.3, if you're trying to grow forage crops or hay or legumes, you're definitely thinking sulfur. Do I need sulfur? So does everyone kind of see how we're looking at, are we have adequate or not? It's the same process. And the tricky part, which is obviously the tricky part of all soil tests, using soil tests, is benchmarking. Where do I find a benchmark? And you can see from Colin's, your example, Colin, that, I've given you a benchmark of 20 to 30, and you had a crop that grew pretty well on, sorry, I just got that question from, you grew a pretty good crop at 15. So it's not black and white, and you do have to kind of look at paddock results as well. But I would suggest to you that if you're 15, 10, it will respond to some sulfur. Robert, I don't know the answer to that. I can't tell you the influence of high sulfur on the prussic acid formation in sorghums, beyond my pay grade. So all I can say in answer to that one is that plants selectively take up what they need within reason. So they won't overtake up sulfur if they don't need it. So just because it's a high sulfur environment that they're growing in, they won't sort of just take up. They do actively select what they want within some limitations. Nitrogen is an exception in that, because they take it up with their water, soluble nitrogen, so they'll just suck it in even if they don't need it all. But yeah, I can't give you a specific on that. That's something that the DPI, maybe we can find out, but yeah, it's a curly one. And so, yeah, then we've got you rate your situation. If we come back to our 5 steps, am I high, medium, or low in available sulfur? And can I optimize what I've already got in my soil? That's that last question. If I don't get enough cycling from my own soil type, then I have to add it in if I think I'm below my target. Okay, so I've already had a few burning curly questions here on sulfur. Sorry I couldn't give you a better answer on that prussic acid one, but yeah, that's a plant physiology thing beyond me. But yeah, today we've covered a few key things there. We've looked at soil fertility, total and available level of nutrients, and we've seen that different soils have different kind of balances of overall fertility. And then we've looked at sort of that process of measuring available fertility for my enterprise. And I need to look at the total. Do I have any in reserve? But then I also need to know how much is cycling now. And that example column that you guys have where, you know, it's gone from 15 to 2, that's partly going to be a seasonal thing. And it could well partly be the fact that in the short term, the crop has taken off some of that available phosphorus out of the system. And then my other question I'm going to ask you is how much phosphorus did you fertilize the crop with before you put it out? You know, what was your rate of fertilizer? And all of those questions come into it. But if you use the available benchmarks as a rule of thumb, and then keep your eye on the paddock results, what's actually happening, did the crops grow or not? And have I got symptoms of phosphorus or sulfur or nitrogen deficiency? Sort of look at things carefully. You can start to really tailor your own program, if you like, still using your soil tests from the agronomist. But just be mindful that a lot of commercial agronomy, and I'll probably get myself into trouble again, Dave, a lot of commercial agronomy kind of goes, let's just put out the fertilizer because it's low risk. If I just load up the paddock with nutrients, I know I'm going to get a crop. But if you want to make money from crops, you've got to target your fertilizers, because every dollar saved from an input is a dollar on the profit. A dollar of cost save is a direct dollar to the profit line. So, you know, targeting your fertilizers, and the classic example is that paddock that I showed you before from North Queensland, where the guys were putting out a lot of nitrogen fertilizers, and the paddock was actually limiting in phosphorus and sulfur. And they spent tens of thousands of dollars trying to grow this Rhodes grass, and every year putting on more and more and different types of products, but they weren't addressing the limiting nutrient. It was only when we addressed phosphorus and sulfur that they got really good hay production. So they burn a lot of money to get to that point. So being careful with your agronomy is important, or using your agro carefully. And so just final thing is that you can't get the complete story off a soil test. You also have to get out and look at plant growth, how the crop performed, soil health, you know, soil structure, pH, all of these other things, unless you're assessing soil health as well, because they could be limiting your crop. You might be putting out the fertilizer and it's still not growing. Well, it's got nothing to do with the nutrients at that point. And that's what the cane farmers sort of found. They kept putting out more and more fertilizers over 20 years and the yields kept going down. So it wasn't a problem of nutrients because they were putting more out every year. It was a problem of soil health, compaction, pH, all of these things that was limiting yield. So soil tests are a tool to help you manage your soil asset well, and they help you to target your inputs. That's the second key thing they help with. So they help you manage soil health and they help you target inputs, particularly fertilizer inputs. So just as a quick summary, I sent Anne, and she'll have sent on to you a soil action plan. I'm not sure if anyone's had time to see it yet, because it was a bit of a late email. But what we'll do next week, if you want to come back for round 4, and then I'll knock you out at that point, we can go over using your soil action plan. I can just take you through that, and you can pull your results out, put them in the worksheet, and that way you can identify for your place and your enterprise what your potential limiting issues are that you may have to spend money on. So I kind of pull this webinar series together, if you like. A bit like what we've been doing today. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm mindful I've gone over time by a few minutes, but if there's any last burning questions, now's the time to throw them out. Otherwise, I'll leave you with these cane guys that have now got regulations on them. So they have to be really careful because they can break the law. If they don't get the right soil test and do the agronomy well, they can end up in jail, which is a great shame for them and everyone else, I reckon. But anyway, so yeah, it's just doing the right thing. And so these guys are just keen to save money. And that's the main reason that they want to get better at their nutrient management. And thanks for being part of the webinar. So I know we're going to have a fourth one where we'll pull it together. But yeah, I appreciate you making the effort, and hopefully you got something out of it.
Very good. Any questions, anybody? Righto. No one's got any questions. We'll bring it all together next week because I think that's where, everyone can go through and explain what they're hoping to achieve for their soil tests, and then answer everyone's questions. That'll be brilliant.
No worries,
thanks again, David, and thanks, also for being available for a follow-up one. So,
no worries. Yep.
And I just want to check with everyone. Is everyone happy with the 6:30, or would you rather it have it a little bit later? Anyone? We just keep going with 6:30, or would you rather 7 or 7:30? No responses.
Yeah. No, you got 6:30 is all good from a few people. Yep.
Oh, yes, sorry, I'm not watching the chat there. Yep, okay. I'm expecting everyone to just talk. Okay, no, that's fine. Okay, well, we'll go with that. We'll go with 6:30. Sounds good. Thanks very much, everyone. Good night. Thanks, David.
No worries. See everyone. No, thanks for having
and
us
I have
on.
recorded it, everyone, so I can send a recording through. See you then.